Hey guys, tonight we're spending some time with the people who walked into the Alaskan wilderness and never walked back out. Some of them were experienced. Some of them had lived in the North their whole lives. One of them was a congressman on a routine flight between two cities, and one of them was a woman who simply left a campsite at midnight after an argument and was gone before morning. What they share is not carelessness, and it is not some dark force written into the land. What they share is that Alaska is large enough and empty enough and old enough to close over a person the way water closes over a dropped stone, leaving almost nothing behind. Before we settle in for this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually find value in what we do here. No pressure and no guilt if you would rather just listen. And thank you, truly, for the case suggestions you keep sending. Many of tonight's names came from you. We are also now on Spotify, so the link is in the description if you would like to listen there while you rest. Now, dim those lights and settle in. This is a long one, and these are stories that deserve to be told slowly and heard carefully. Each of these people was somebody's whole world before they became a case file. A father who counseled orphan children, a free spirit who worked the pipeline, a nurse who kept everyone else's schedules but never quite settled his own. We are going to give them the patience they were owed. Have you ever wondered what it really takes for a person to disappear completely in a country crossed by satellites and search planes and phones that ping a tower every few minutes? Have you ever wondered how a place can be beautiful and merciless in the very same breath? And when we say someone vanished without a trace, what does that phrase actually cost the people who are left standing at the edge of the trees, calling a name into the dark? To understand any of it, we need to start with the land itself. Let's talk about Alaska, because you cannot understand these disappearances without first understanding the ground they happened on. On a map, it looks like a single state, one shape among 50, tucked up in the corner where the page runs out. That map lies to you. If you could lay Alaska down over the lower part of the country, it would stretch from the coast of Georgia to the coast of California. It holds most of the tallest mountains on the continent and more than 100,000 glaciers and something close to 3 million lakes, most of which have never been named because there has never been anyone there to name them. More than half of all the federally protected wilderness in the entire nation sits inside this one state, and almost nobody lives there. Fewer than 750,000 people share a space that vast, and most of them are gathered into a handful of towns, clinging to the coastline and the few roads that exist. Step off those roads in almost any direction, and within an hour, you can be somewhere that no human being has stood in years. There are more caribou than people. There are stretches of forest and tundra and mountain where the nearest other person might be 40 or 50 miles away, across rivers with no bridges and valleys with no trails. You're standing at the edge of one of those places right now, in your mind. The spruce trees are close together and dark, and they go on past anything you can see. The ground under your boots is soft with moss that swallows the sound of your own steps. Somewhere off to your left, there's the low, constant noise of water moving over rock, a creek you cannot see. The air smells of cold earth and green needles. It is the middle of the afternoon, and the light is already going grey and flat because the clouds have come down low over the ridgeline. If you turned around 3 times quickly, you would not be able to say for certain which direction you came from. And that is the honest, unglamorous heart of almost every story we are going to tell tonight. Because there is a name that gets attached to this part of the world, and you have probably heard it. People call it the Alaska Triangle. The idea goes that if you draw lines connecting the city of Anchorage in the south, Juneau down in the southeastern panhandle, and the far northern town once called Barrow and now called Utqiagvik, you enclose a region where people go missing at a rate that is genuinely, measurably higher than the national average. The numbers that get repeated are large. Some accounts say that more than 16,000 people have vanished inside that triangle since the late 1980s. Others put the figure past 20,000 going back to the 1970s. The disappearance rate for the state as a whole runs at roughly twice the national average, and the rate at which those missing people are never found runs higher still. Now, here is where we are going to be careful, because being careful is the whole point of a night like this. Around those numbers, an entire industry of explanation has grown up. You will find people who will tell you with real conviction that the triangle sits over an energy vortex, a place where electromagnetic forces bend compasses and swallow aircraft and open, if you believe the more dramatic tellings, doorways into somewhere else. You will find people who point to the old stories of the Tlingit and the Tsimshian peoples, and to a shape-shifting figure in that folklore, an otter-like being said to lure the lost deeper into the trees. You will find talk of strange lights and of creatures glimpsed at the edge of a clearing and of a lost pyramid buried somewhere beneath the ice. We are not going to spend our night there, not because those stories are not interesting, and not to insult anyone who finds meaning in them, but because the people we are here for deserve the truth, and the truth is quieter and, in its own way, far heavier, because there is a genuine phenomenon in that country called magnetic declination, where a compass can be pulled as much as 30 degrees off true, enough to walk a confident person in exactly the wrong direction for a very long time. There is a weather that can drop a wall of fog over a mountainside in minutes. There are crevasses hidden under snow bridges, and rivers cold enough to take the strength from a body in a matter of minutes, and a bear population large enough that the wilderness is never truly empty of things that are hungry. And there is that sheer, staggering scale where a fallen aircraft or a lost hiker can be covered by one night's snowfall and simply cease to be findable. To be fair to the people who reach for the supernatural, they are reaching for it because the alternative is almost harder to sit with. It is easier, somehow, to believe that a doorway opened than to believe that a father of a family walked a few hundred feet off a marked route into fog and was gone forever, close enough to town that thousands of people were within a mile of him. The mundane explanation asks you to accept that the world can be that arbitrary and that the ground can be that indifferent, and most of us do not want to accept that. We want a reason. The families we are going to meet tonight have spent decades learning to live without one. So let me be clear about what we are doing. We are not going to treat Alaska as a haunted place. We are going to treat it as an honest one, a landscape that does exactly what a landscape of its size and cold and emptiness will always do, which is occasionally, and without any malice at all, keep the people who go into it. The mystery in these cases is not whether something otherworldly happened, The mystery almost always is simply where. Where did the plane come down? Where did the current carry her? Where, in 10,000 square miles of spruce and rock and river, does a person come to rest when there is no one there to find them? And so we begin where the modern legend itself began, on an ordinary autumn morning, with two well-known men, a young pilot, and a small plane that took off into low cloud and was never seen again. The morning of the 16th of October, 1972, was grey and unsettled over southern Alaska, the kind of low, wet autumn sky that pilots watch with one eye while they drink their coffee. In Anchorage that morning, 4 men were preparing to make a short flight down the coast to Juneau, the state capital, a trip of some 560 miles that a small plane could manage in a few hours if the weather cooperated. The weather was not really cooperating, but it was not clearly refusing either, and in Alaska, in those years, that was often enough. The most famous name among the 4 was Hale Boggs, and to understand why his disappearance became the seed of an entire legend, you have to understand who he was. Boggs was the House Majority Leader, one of the most senior elected officials in the country, a Louisiana congressman who had been in Washington for the better part of 3 decades. He had served on the Warren Commission, the body that investigated the assassination of President Kennedy, and he was known to have had private doubts about some of that commission's conclusions. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of man about whom people are inclined to build theories, and we will get to those theories, and we will handle them fairly. But first, he was a person. He was a husband. His wife, Lindy Boggs, would later win his seat in Congress and hold it for nearly 2 decades of her own, and their daughter, the journalist Cokie Roberts, would become a familiar voice in millions of American homes. That was the family waiting on the other end of this flight. The reason Boggs was in Alaska at all was the second man on the plane, Nick Begich. Begich was Alaska's lone congressman, a first-term Democrat facing re-election, and Boggs had flown up to help him campaign, to lend the weight of his name to a younger colleague in a hard race. Begich was a former teacher, a father of 6, a man who had built a life in a state that was still, in many ways, a frontier. His son, Mark, was a boy then. Years later, that boy would grow up to become a United States Senator, carrying his father's name back into the very institution that had lost him. But on that October morning, Nick Begich was simply a congressman trying to get to Juneau, sitting in a small plane beside a colleague and a friend. The third man was Russell Brown, one of Begich's aides, a young man whose name is almost never mentioned first in these accounts and who deserves better than that. He was there to do his job. He had a family too. And the fourth man was the pilot, Don Johns, an experienced Alaskan aviator who had written, not long before, an article about flying in ice, about the particular dangers of the northern skies. Johns knew this country from the air as well as almost anyone. He had logged thousands of hours over exactly this terrain. He was not a novice being caught out by a routine hazard. He was a professional, and that is part of what has made this case so difficult to lay to rest. You're sitting in the cabin of that plane as it lifts off from Anchorage. It is a twin-engine Cessna, small, loud, the kind of aircraft that is the workhorse of Alaskan travel because so many places in the state can be reached no other way. Below you, the city thins quickly into forest and water, and then the water becomes Prince William Sound, and then the coast rises into the Chugach Mountains, white and folded and enormous. The cloud is layered around you, closing and opening. Somewhere ahead is a long stretch of the most rugged coastline on the continent, and beyond that, Juneau. The plane climbs into the grey, and that is the last certain thing anyone can tell you about Hale Boggs, Nick Begich, Russell Brown, and Don Johns. They never arrived. When the plane failed to reach Juneau, and the hours stretched past any reasonable estimate of its fuel, the machinery of a search began to turn, and what followed became the largest air and sea search that had ever been conducted in the United States up to that time. For more than a month, something on the order of 50 civilian aircraft and 40 military aircraft crossed and recrossed the search area, along with ships and ground parties. The area they covered was measured in the hundreds of thousands of square miles. The nation was watching because 2 members of Congress do not simply evaporate, and yet that is very nearly what seemed to have happened. Day after day the planes went up into that broken country, and day after day they came back with nothing. There was no wreckage, no debris on the water, no fire scar on a mountainside, no oil slick, nothing at all. After 39 days, the search was called off. Not one piece of the plane, and not one trace of the 4 men aboard it was ever found. To this day, more than 50 years later, no confirmed wreckage from that flight has ever been recovered. 4 men flew into a grey sky between 2 American cities and were erased from the world as completely as if they had never taken off. It is worth sitting for a moment with what those 39 days were actually like, because we tend to summarize a search into a sentence, and a search is not a sentence. It is a slow, daily crucifixion of hope. Every morning for more than a month, planes went up into that broken country, and every morning the families of these 4 men woke to the possibility that today would be the day, that a spotter would catch a glint of metal on a snowfield, a wing, a fire scar, anything. And every evening the planes came back and there was nothing, and the families had to find a way to sleep and wake and hope again. Multiply that by 39. The whole nation was watching, which brought its own strange weight, the sense that this grief was public property unfolding on the news, while inside it there were people simply waiting to be told whether their husband, their father, was alive. And here is something we should say plainly, because it happens in almost every one of these stories. 2 of those 4 families have spent 50 years standing in the shadow of the other 2. When people tell this story, they tell it as the vanishing of Hale Boggs, sometimes of Boggs and Begich, the 2 important men. But Russell Brown, the young aide, had people who loved him and who mourned him no less for his not being famous. And Don Johns, the pilot, a man who knew that sky as well as anyone alive, left behind his own family, his own grieving, and he is too often reduced to a footnote, the one flying the plane, as though the man at the controls were not also a person with a whole life ending in that same cold air. 4 men were lost that day, not 2, and the arithmetic of grief does not care about titles. Every one of those 4 absences was total and permanent and equally deserving of being named. When the search was finally called off after 39 days, someone had to make that call, and someone had to carry it to the families. The news that the greatest search and rescue effort the country had ever mounted was going to stop, that the planes would not go up tomorrow, that this was, in the language of institutions, the end. There is no gentle way to tell 4 families that the looking is over and there's still nothing to bury. That moment, repeated across every case we will touch tonight, is one of the cruelest a person can endure. because it asks them to accept two impossible things at once: that their person is gone and that they will never know where. The Boggs and Begich families would go on to remarkable things, carrying the loss with a public grace that few could manage. But underneath the grace, the wound stayed exactly where it was, unhealed, because a wound with no ending cannot close. Now, let's talk about what likely happened, because the honest answer and the dramatic answer are two different things, and both deserve to be on the table. The grounded explanation, the one favored by most people who have studied the case seriously, is heartbreakingly simple. The weather was poor. Icing was a real and present danger, the very danger Don Johns had written about. A plane that ices up can lose lift and control with terrible speed, and it can go into the water of the Sound or the flank of a mountain in seconds. If it went into deep, cold water, it could sink beyond any hope of recovery. If it went into the mountains, one season's snow could bury it, and the next season's could bury it deeper until the wreckage became just another shape under the ice. In country like that, a vanishing this complete does not require anything stranger than physics and bad luck. But because Hale Boggs was who he was, other theories arrived almost immediately, and they have never entirely gone away. There are those who point to his role on the Warren Commission and his doubts about its findings, and who suggest that his disappearance was not an accident at all. We are not going to pretend those whispers do not exist, because they are part of the story of how this case entered the public imagination. But we are also going to be honest with you. There has never been any evidence in more than 5 decades to support the idea that the flight was anything other than a small plane lost to weather in a place that loses small planes with grim regularity. The theory persists not because there is proof, but because the alternative, the sheer randomness of it, is so hard to accept when the man at the center of it was so important. Which is to say, the mystery here is human, as much as it is factual. We do not know exactly where that plane came down. We do know that wanting a larger meaning does not make one true. There is one thing this disappearance changed, and it is worth pausing on, because it is the rare case where a loss produced something that has saved other lives. In the years after the Boggs flight vanished, in part because of it, the country moved to require that aircraft carry emergency locator transmitters, small devices designed to broadcast a signal automatically after a crash so that searchers can find a downed plane and, sometimes, the people still alive inside it. Countless aviators in the decades since have been found because of a beacon that exists in some measure, because 4 men were never found at all. It does not undo anything, but it is not nothing either. And here is the part that tells you the Boggs flight was not some singular event, some one-time tear in the fabric of that country. It was not even the first time Alaska had swallowed an aircraft whole. Have you ever wondered how a plane full of people can simply cease to exist over American soil? It had already happened, more than 20 years earlier, on a scale that dwarfs even the Boggs case. In the winter of 1950, a large military transport, a 4-engine Skymaster, took off from Anchorage carrying 44 people, bound for the lower states far to the southeast. Among them were service members, crew, and a small number of civilians, ordinary people making an ordinary crossing in the dead of an Alaskan January. The plane made its scheduled radio contact after takeoff, everything routine, everything calm, and then the radio went quiet, the way a conversation goes quiet when someone simply stops speaking mid-sentence. The Skymaster never reached its destination. It never made another call. It was as if the sky had closed a hand around it. The search that followed was, again, enormous for its era, drawing in dozens upon dozens of aircraft from both the United States and Canada, crossing that impossible landscape in the shortening winter light. 44 people. And not one of them, and not one bolt of the aircraft that carried them was ever found. 44 families received the same impossible news, that their person had left on a plane and would not be arriving, and that there was nothing to bury, nothing to see, nothing to hold. Whole lives gone into the white. When you set those two disappearances side by side, the 1950 Skymaster and the 1972 Cessna, you begin to feel the actual shape of this place. This is a country where aircraft are not exotic. They are the buses and the taxis and the ambulances of the North, the only way to reach most of the state. And so the sky over Alaska is busier with small and vulnerable planes than almost anywhere on Earth. And that same country is cold enough and vast enough and folded enough to hide what falls into it permanently on a scale from a single lost hunter to 44 souls at once. The legend of the triangle did not invent the danger. The danger invented the legend. But planes, at least, are large. They are metal, and they carry beacons now, and when one goes down, there is at least the theory of a wreck to search for. Let's talk about how much smaller and quieter a disappearance can be when it is just one person, on foot, alone, with a river on one side and the whole of the Arctic on the other. Gary Frank Sotherden was, by every account his family ever gave, a free spirit, and that phrase, which people use so loosely, was in his case a plain description of a life. He came from Clay, New York, a town about a dozen miles from Syracuse, ordinary country in the middle of the state, and from a young age he seemed built for somewhere wider than that. After high school, he did not settle. He traveled across the United States and up into Canada, chasing the kind of experience that does not come with a paycheck attached, collecting places the way other young men collected possessions. And in the early 1970s, like a lot of restless young Americans in that decade, he found his way to Alaska, which in those years was in the middle of something close to a gold rush. The gold, that time, was oil. The great Trans-Alaska Pipeline was being pushed across the state, an enormous undertaking that pulled in workers from everywhere with the promise of good money and hard labor in a wild place. Gary worked the pipeline for a few years. You can picture the appeal for a man like him, the combination of a real wage and a real frontier, the chance to be part of something huge while standing at the very edge of the map. But the pipeline was a job, and Gary Sotherden was not, at heart, a man who lived for jobs. He lived for the country beyond them. And in 1976, at 25 years old, he set out on the kind of trip that had probably been forming in his mind the whole time he was in the North. He and a friend, a man remembered simply as Stan, made their way up toward the Arctic Circle, to the Porcupine River, a remote, winding tributary of the Yukon that runs through the far northeastern corner of Alaska and slips across the border into Canada. This was not a weekend outing. The plan the two of them made was audacious and, in hindsight, terribly exposed. They would explore the Porcupine separately, starting on opposite sides of the river, each man alone with the country, and they would meet back up later in the spring, when the cold came down hard enough to freeze the river solid and let them cross to one another. Think about the confidence that plan required, and the youth. Months apart, alone, in one of the emptiest places on the continent, trusting the seasons themselves to bring you back together. You're on the bank of the Porcupine in the late summer of 1976. The river is wide and slow and the color of weak tea, carrying the silt of 1,000 miles down toward the Yukon. On your side, the land rises into low, rolling tundra and stands of stunted spruce, and the light in that latitude does strange, beautiful things, lingering for hours at the horizon. There is no trail, there is no cabin, there is no sound that a person made. Somewhere across that water is your friend, a speck you cannot see, and the agreement between you is the only thread connecting you to another human being for as far as the mind can stretch. For Gary Sotherden, that was not a nightmare. That was the whole point, and it was freedom. Stan made it out. When the season turned and the time came to reunite, and then when it came to leave, Stan came home. Gary did not. He was never heard from again. And so began the first search, the one his family launched from 3,000 miles away in upstate New York, trying to move heaven and earth for a son lost at the top of the world. Planes flew over that remote, winding river, searching the banks for any sign of a young man who had gone in alone and not come out. Police searched, and still there was nothing but the river and the tundra and the silence. His parents, unwilling to simply accept a void, did something that tells you everything about the love behind this case. They hired a mountain guide, a man who knew that country, and in 1977, they sent him up the Porcupine by canoe to look for their son. And the guide found something. He found Gary's site, the place where he had been. He found Gary's broken glasses. He found Gary's identification, small human objects resting in the enormous emptiness, saying only that a young man had been here and had been here no longer. The guide did not find Gary. He found the shape of his absence. With that, the family did what families in these situations are eventually forced to do. They accepted, without ever being told, that Gary was gone. They assumed, from the broken glasses and the harsh country and a spell of bad weather that had moved through, that he had died of exposure, that the cold had taken him the way the cold takes the unlucky in that latitude. In the family cemetery plot, they placed a tombstone with his name on it, and beneath the name, they had these words carved: lost in Alaska in the 1970s, not died, lost, because they did not know, and the honesty of that word, chosen and set in stone, is one of the most quietly devastating details in any story we have ever told. They loved him enough to tell the truth on his own grave, which was that they did not have him, and did not know where he was, and there the case rested for a very long time. Have you ever wondered how long a family can hold a question like that, an open wound with no edges, before it simply becomes part of who they are? For the Sotherdens, it was decades. Gary's brother, Stephen, would spend the better part of 45 years living beside that not knowing, the family inventing, in his own words, their own private theories of what might have happened, each of them a way to get through another year without an answer. But the country was not quite as silent as it seemed. In July of 1997, more than 20 years after Gary walked into the Arctic, a hunter was moving along the Porcupine River about 8 miles from the Canadian border in almost exactly the region where a young man had vanished 2 decades before. And there, on the ground, he found a human skull. He did the right thing. He contacted the Alaska State Troopers in Fairbanks, and troopers came out and collected it. They searched for the rest and found nothing more, just the skull, alone. As if the land had offered up this single piece and kept everything else. It went to the state medical examiner's office, where it became what such things become when there is no name to attach, a set of unidentified human remains, filed and shelved and waiting. But the examiners could read one thing in it, and it was not gentle. Looking at the shape and the size and the placement of the marks on that skull, the punctures left in the bone, they concluded that this person had most likely been killed by a bear. The pattern of the tooth penetrations told a story of an animal and of a death that came hard and fast in a place with no one to hear it. They could not say whose skull it was. They could only say how, in all likelihood, its owner had died. And then, for a second time, the case went quiet. For another 25 years, the skull waited. The tombstone in New York waited. The family lived their lives around the hole where Gary had been. What finally broke it open was the same quiet revolution that has reopened so many old cases in recent years, the rise of genetic genealogy. This is the technique, the same one that famously identified the Golden State Killer, in which investigators take DNA from unknown remains and compare it not against a criminal database, but against the vast public family trees that ordinary people have built by sending their spit to ancestry companies. In 2022, cold case investigators in Alaska turned that technique on the skull from the porcupine. They extracted a DNA profile. They ran it against the genealogy databases, and they found a thread, a distant relative, a second cousin whose own DNA, submitted to a home testing service for the innocent purpose of tracing a family tree, pointed like a needle back toward a name, Gary Frank Sotherden. To be certain, they needed a closer match, and so, in December of 2022, Stephen Sotherden's phone rang, and it was the Alaska State Troopers calling about a brother who had been lost for 46 years, asking whether he would give a sample of his own DNA to confirm what they already strongly suspected. He agreed, of course. Within days, it was done. The skull found by a hunter on the Porcupine River in 1997 belonged to the young man who had walked into that same country in 1976. After nearly half a century, Gary had a name again. For the family, the answer was a relief and a wound at the same time. And Stephen was honest about that in a way that stays with you. They had spent 45 years, he said, coming up with their own gentle, unrealistic ideas of what might have happened, stories soft enough to live with. And then, in an instant, those stories were replaced by the real one, which was harder and more brutal than any of them had let themselves imagine. It was, he said, more brutal than any of us had hoped. It was not what any of us would have chosen. Sit with that for a moment. For 45 years, not knowing was its own kind of mercy, and the truth, when it finally came, took that mercy away even as it gave them their brother back. Now, in fairness, the story is not perfectly closed even now, and we will not pretend that it is. The troopers were careful in their own language. Based on the marks, they said, the person appears to have been a victim of a bear. But, they added, it is not known whether the bear was actually the cause of death, or whether it came upon a man already dead from something else, the cold, an injury, a fall. And at least one of Gary's closest friends, a man who had known him and who now lives in Alaska himself, has said plainly that he's not convinced a bear killed Gary at all. We do not know, with certainty, the final minutes of Gary Sotherden's life. What we know is where those minutes ended, on the bank of a river at the top of the world, and that a family that had carved the word lost into a headstone can finally, if they choose, carve something more certain now. His remains were returned to New York. The family planned a memorial and a tombstone that had said, for decades, only that a young man was lost in Alaska could at last become the marker of a young man who was found. Gary Sotherden got the rarest thing in all of these stories, the thing almost none of the others we will speak of tonight have been given. He got an ending. It took the river 46 years to give him back, and it gave him back in pieces, and even then it kept the details to itself. But it gave him back, and there is a reason to hold on to that because of how it happened. Gary Sotherden was not found by a better search or a lucky spotter. He was found by a technology that did not exist for most of the years he was missing, sitting in a lab, comparing the DNA in a shelved skull against the family trees that millions of ordinary people have quietly built. Think about what that means for the others. All across Alaska, in the medical examiner's office, and in evidence rooms, there are unidentified human remains, bones recovered from riverbanks and mountainsides and roadside brush over the decades, each one a person, each one belonging to a family somewhere that never got their answer. For most of the last century, those remains were simply filed and waited on because there was no way to give them a name. Now, slowly, there is. The same quiet science that told the Sotherdens where their son had been all those years is being turned case by case on the backlog of the nameless. Some of the people we are speaking of tonight, or people like them, may yet be identified this way, years or decades from now, by a cousin who spat into a tube for a lark and never knew they held the missing piece of someone else's grief. It is slow, and it is not certain, and it cannot bring anyone back. But it can end the not knowing, and in these stories, the not knowing is its own kind of death. So anything that ends it is worth naming as the small mercy it is. Gary got his name back. It is not impossible that others will too. Most of them, it does not. Let's talk about a man who did not disappear into the deep wilderness at all, but who vanished at the very edge of a city, close to hotels and highways and other people, and whose case carries something the others so far have not. The cold suggestion that in his story, the danger may not have been the land. Thomas Anthony Nuzzi was a nurse, and by the accounts of the people who worked with him, a good and dutiful one. He was 52 years old in the summer of 2001, a man from the lower states who had come to Alaska and found a way of living there that suited him, and that also, in the end, made him very hard to find. Nuzzi was a traveling nurse. He picked up assignments all over that enormous state, flying from town to town wherever the work was, and rather than keep a home he did not have time to live in, he simply stayed in motels, moving as the work moved. The only fixed address he had, the only rent he paid, was on a storage unit in Anchorage, where the pieces of a settled life sat waiting for a settling that never quite came. There is a particular loneliness in that arrangement, and also a particular freedom, and Nuzzi seems to have carried both. He had, by the descriptions that survive, few close friends and no permanent place, a man who kept everyone else's medications and schedules straight, while his own life stayed loose and portable. That way of living is not a crime and it is not a flaw, but it meant something terrible when he disappeared, which is that there was almost no one positioned to notice quickly. When a person has a spouse, a landlord, a standing dinner on Sundays, their absence rings a bell within hours. Newsy had built a life with very few bells in it. In June of 2001, he had an assignment in Bethel, a hub community out in western Alaska, reachable from Anchorage by a short flight. He was staying, in the meantime, at a Super 8 motel on Minnesota Drive in Anchorage. He was last seen by friends on the 15th of June. And then the record of his life narrows down to a single, strange, grainy window, the last confirmed sighting of Thomas Newsy anywhere on Earth. It comes from a security camera. On the 18th of June, at 47 minutes past 9 in the evening, a store camera near his motel captured him buying a small handful of things: cigarettes, a couple of lighters, chips, a soda, the kind of purchase a person makes without thinking on a night they have no idea is their last. There is a receipt for it. And he was not alone. On the footage, and in the accounts that followed, Newsy was in the company of a woman, someone the people who knew him did not recognize. The next day, the 19th, Newsy failed to show up for his work in Bethel, and this is the thing that finally rang a bell. The only bell there was. A dutiful nurse does not simply not appear. His co-workers knew something was wrong, and he was reported missing. And when people began, belatedly, to look for Thomas Newsy, what they found did not settle anything. It only deepened the unease. His vehicle turned up first. His red Jeep Cherokee was found at the Alpenglow ski area up in Chugach State Park, about 12 miles outside of Anchorage, at the very place where the city's edge dissolves into mountain wilderness. The keys were inside it, and here is a detail that matters, because it seems to point away from the simplest wilderness explanation. His bicycle was found back at his storage unit, which was left unlocked, so investigators came to believe that when Newsy vanished, he was on foot. A man on foot, his car abandoned with the keys in it at the edge of a state park, his bike left behind at an unlocked unit. On its own, that might read as a hiker who walked into the mountains and never walked out. One more person taken by the Chugach the way the Chugach takes people. But the rest of it does not read that way at all. And this is where the case turns cold in a different direction. Because in the days around his disappearance, other people were seen where Newsy should have been, and they were not Newsy. A security guard reported watching a woman and a man, neither of them Newsy, trying to break into his Jeep on the 15th of June, the very day he was last seen by friends. The staff at the motel later described an odd pair, a man and a woman, in Newsy's room. When one of his friends, a man named Guernsey, called the motel and asked for Newsy, a man answered who sounded nothing like him, and then handed the phone to a woman who said that Newsy had checked out. A housekeeper, going to clean the room, found a young woman answering the door, and later a man sitting on the bed who told her to leave. You're standing in the parking lot of that motel on Minnesota Drive, and none of it fits. The man's car is at a mountain trailhead 12 miles away with the keys in it. His bike is across town at a storage unit no one locked. And here in his room are two strangers, a woman and a tall, thin man with badly decaying teeth, answering his phone, telling his friends he is gone. A person does not usually walk into the wilderness and leave two strangers behind to run his motel room. The wilderness at the edge of the city may be exactly where the trail was meant to end. in the sense that a car at a trailhead is a very tidy way to make a disappearance look like an accident of the land. Newsy's nephew, a man named Stephen Reeves, did the kind of dogged, grieving detective work that families are so often forced to do when a case stalls. He called back every number in his uncle's phone, the recent calls, the missed calls, the numbers dialed. They led to pagers, to motels, to a halfway house. Not one of the people who answered had ever heard of Thomas Newsy. Reeves took what he found to the police, and there was, for a while, movement. A detective acknowledged that there were just enough oddities in what the nephew had uncovered to warrant a closer look, and 2 detectives were assigned. And then, as happens so often in these accounts, the investigation stalled. The woman and the man were named as persons of interest. They were never identified. They were never charged with anything. We want to be very clear about that, because they remain, to this day, unknown and uncharged, and it is not our place to convict anyone, named or unnamed, of anything. What we can say is only what the record says. The 2 people no one could identify appear to have been moving through the last hours of Thomas Newsy's known life, and that no one has ever explained who they were or what became of him. To be fair, there is a version of this story that is still, technically, about the wilderness. It is possible that Newsy did drive his own jeep to the Chugach and walked into the park and died there of a fall or the elements, and that the strangers in his room are a separate and coincidental strangeness, the kind of loose thread that any messy life leaves behind. Investigators could not rule the wilderness out, but most people who have looked closely at this case do not feel the pull toward the mountains. They feel the pull toward those 2 figures no one could name. And there is a line from Newsy's friend Guernsey that we have not been able to stop thinking about because it speaks to something larger than this one case, something that runs quietly underneath a great many of these Alaskan disappearances. Guernsey believed his friend had been killed, and he was bitter about how little was done. When a young woman disappears, he said, the police and the public go all out. A middle-aged man, he said, they do not seem to care too much about. Somebody knows something they are not talking about. I want to see some justice. He never got it. Thomas Newsy is still listed on the state's roll of missing persons, more than 20 years on. There has been no justice and no answer and no grave. A nurse who spent his life tending to strangers in a hard country slipped out of that country so quietly that the only bell his absence rang was a missed shift 400 miles away in a town he never reached. Whether the wilderness took him or whether someone used the wilderness as a place to hide what they had done, we do not know. We only know that he is gone, and that a man who cared for so many people deserved to have more of them looking for him. Have you ever wondered how many of these cases are truly mysteries of the land, and how many are mysteries of people dressed up in the land's clothing? It is a question worth holding on to, because the 2 stories we turn to now pull in opposite directions from Newsy's. Both of them happened in the same brief stretch of a single Alaskan summer, only days apart, and in both of them, the wilderness itself is very much the prime suspect. And yet even there, in the 2 cases where the mountains and the water are the likeliest answer, the questions do not entirely close. Every year, on the 4th of July, the small fishing town of Seward, Alaska, holds a foot race up the mountain that stands over it. The mountain is called Mount Marathon, and the race takes its name from the peak and if you only read the numbers, you would not understand why grown, serious athletes speak about it with something close to fear. It is barely 3 miles long. It starts at sea level, on the streets of a town of a few thousand people, with spectators packed along the road. On paper, it is a short race, but in those 3 miles it climbs and then plunges back down, more than 3,000 feet of near vertical mountain, up cliffs and mud and shale and scree, and back down over rock fields and snow and the tops of waterfalls, on slopes that in places tilt to nearly 40 degrees. The good runners do not descend so much as fall in a controlled way, dropping thousands of feet in a handful of minutes. The race has been run as an organized event since 1915, and for almost a century, through all of that danger, it had never killed anyone. Michael LeMaitre was the kind of man who would want to run it. He was in his mid-60s, an Anchorage businessman and a grandfather, and if you built a list of the things that filled his life, you would run out of room before you ran out of things. He held a doctorate in business administration. He volunteered with hospice, sitting with the dying. He used his skill with words to help members of the armed forces at the local base write their way into civilian careers. And in the aftermath of the September attacks in 2001, he counseled children who had been orphaned that day, sitting with a different kind of grief. This was not a reckless man chasing a thrill. This was a man in constant, generous motion, someone who, in the words of his own family, always seemed able to make things work out. He had come to Alaska from New York, and he had built his whole adult life there, around the outdoors, with his wife Peggy and their children, boating, hiking, camping, cross-country skiing, fishing, crabbing, and sailing. He had run the Ititaski, the long, punishing ski event, several times. He was fit. He had finished a race just a month before. And Mount Marathon had been on his list for years, one of those things a certain kind of person needs to do simply because it is there and it is hard. Entry to the race is decided partly by lottery, because far more people want to run it than the mountain can safely hold, and that year Michael won a spot. His daughter Marianne remembered how he felt about it. He had won the lottery, and that was it. He was going. There was only one problem, and in Seward, it is considered a serious one. Michael LeMaitre had never been on the mountain. He had never climbed the course, never scouted the route up or the far more dangerous route down. Among the locals and the veterans of the race, going up cold without ever having walked the ground is close to an unforgivable sin, because the mountain does not forgive it. There are no signs on the course. There is no single trail. Runners pick their own way up and down, and a newcomer who does not know the ground can very easily choose wrong. At the pre-race safety talk, this is said out loud, bluntly. If you have not been up that mountain before, one official warned that day, you should consider going home right now, and you should not be in this race. Michael was undeterred. In hindsight, everyone can see the shape of the mistake. But you have to understand the man to understand the choice. He had spent his whole life making things work out, meeting the outdoors on its own terms and coming home. Why would this be any different? So he stayed. Now, let's talk about the day itself, because the weather on the 4th of July, 2012, turned Mount Marathon into something even more dangerous than it usually is. It had rained hard the night before, and the rain kept coming, and the mountain was slick with mud and running water. Fog moved in and out across the upper slopes in strips, so that a runner climbing into it could lose sight of the town below and the summit above at the same time. It was cold. Long-time participants would later say it was some of the worst racing weather they could remember. And that year, the race had been expanded to let more people onto the mountain than ever before. The conditions took a toll almost immediately, and not only on Michael. That same day, 2 other runners were gravely hurt on the descent at roughly the same treacherous spot. One woman, a military veteran and helicopter pilot, went over a cliff and tore her liver and broke ribs. Another runner fell there too and suffered broken legs and a brain injury. Ambulances and rescue were already stretched, already dealing with the kind of catastrophe the mountain hands out in a bad year. Against that backdrop, in that fog, a first-time runner in his mid-60s started up the hill. The second wave of the race, the wave Michael was in, set off in the middle of the afternoon, a little after 3:15, and for a long time, in all that chaos of injury and weather, no one was watching one particular older man make his slow, determined way up into the cloud. You're on the mountain that afternoon. The grade under your hands and feet is savage, so steep in places that it is less running than climbing, hauling yourself up wet rock and slick mud, with the town shrinking below you each time the fog thins enough to let you see it. The rain is cold on the back of your neck, your breath is loud, and the fog keeps closing, a soft grey wall that erases the summit and the sea and the hundreds of other people on the course until it can feel, for long stretches, as though you're the only person on the whole mountain. For most runners that afternoon, the fog was a misery to be pushed through. For Michael LeMaitre, it may have been the thing that killed him, because somewhere up in that grey, a man who had never seen this ground before had to decide again and again which way was up and which way was down and which way was home. The last person to see Michael LeMaitre alive was a race steward named Tom Walsh. It was getting on towards 6 in the evening. Walsh saw Michael still ascending, still working his way upward, only about 200 feet below the turnaround point, the artificial summit where runners are meant to touch and then begin the plunge back down. 200 feet. He was almost there. The volunteers who had been on the mountain all day, 10 hours some of them, were coming down as their shifts ended, and as they descended, they passed this older man near the back of the field, still going up into the thickening fog and the cold. By the accounts that survive, no one who saw him thought he was in trouble. He was moving. He asked for no help. He seemed to the people who passed him like a man who intended to finish. And then Michael LeMaitre climbed the last 200 feet into the cloud and out of the world. He was never seen again. Down at the base of the mountain, Peggy LeMaitre was waiting for her husband. The last thing she had said to him at the starting line was simple, the kind of thing you say 1,000 times without weighing it. She told him she loved him and to have a good race. Now the runners were coming back down off the mountain, muddy and spent, and Michael was not among them. So Peggy did what any of us would do. She started asking. She stopped a runner coming through the brush and asked whether anyone was still behind him. She checked with the race staff, and as the answers came back empty and the afternoon slid toward evening, she went to the bottom of the mountain and she called for him. She stood there and yelled his name up into the fog at the top of her lungs. She told hikers heading up to keep an eye out for him. Hours went by. Nothing came back down but the weather. When she reached a race official, she was told to call back later if he still had not returned. Consider the ordinariness of that instruction for a moment. The assumption that a grown man was simply slow or had wandered off to rest set against what Peggy already felt in her body, which was that something was terribly wrong. Only as it began to grow dark and Michael still had not come down did the emergency response truly begin to move. By around 9 that night, a search was underway. It grew quickly. Within days, the search parties numbered close to 70 people. Helicopters flew the slopes. Technically trained volunteers from the Alaska Mountain Rescue Group worked the cliffs and the scree. Search dogs were brought in. The Alaska Air National Guard lent support. They worked in dangerous conditions, in poor visibility, on the same steep, braided terrain that had already put 2 people in the hospital that day. This was not a token effort. This was a serious, sustained, professional search for a man who had vanished within a mile of thousands of spectators on a course only 3 miles long, on a mountain that stands directly over a town. And they found almost nothing. Over the days that followed, the search turned up a couple of small items that may have been his: a glove, a water bottle, the kind of thing a runner might drop. Years later, Peggy would say she was never even told those items had been found, which is its own small heartbreak, a family and a search operation moving through the same tragedy without quite reaching each other. Beyond those few objects, there was no Michael, no clothing, though he was dressed in dark shorts and a dark shirt that should have stood against the rock. No body. As one trooper put it at the time, there were no clues, no trace, no trail. By the middle of July, with no progress and the weather on the mountain deteriorating, the official search was scaled back, and then, at the family's agreement and the fire department's, called off. Michael LeMaitre had become the first person ever to die, or at least to be presumed dead, in nearly a century of that race. So let's talk about the theories, because a disappearance this strange refuses to let people rest, and over the years a handful of explanations have been turned over again and again. Remember the shape of the impossible thing here. A man vanished on a course only 3 miles long, with hundreds of other runners strung out across the same mountain and tens of thousands of spectators gathered at its foot, and he did it in the middle of the afternoon. How does someone simply cease to exist under those conditions? Each theory is an attempt to answer that, and each one runs into the same wall. The first and simplest is that he fell. The descent off Mount Marathon is genuinely lethal, a plunge over cliffs and scree and the tops of waterfalls, and it is where the mountain does most of its damage. 2 people were gravely hurt falling on the descent that very day. It would be easy to imagine Michael losing his footing on the way down and going over an edge into a place a body would be hard to spot. But there is a problem with that, and it is the last confirmed sighting. Tom Walsh saw Michael still ascending, still going up, only about 200 feet below the turnaround. If he fell somewhere near the top on ground that was searched hard, and he was never found there. The second theory is the one most people who have studied the case come back to, and it fits the fog. The turnaround point on that mountain is not obvious. It is an artificial marker, and there are no signs on the course, and a first-timer who had never been up before, climbing into thick cloud that erased the summit and the sea at once, could very easily have missed it. If Michael went past the turnaround without realizing it, still climbing, looking for a top that kept not arriving, he could have crossed over into the back of the mountain, into a bowl that connects to the next peak, and from there into thousands of square miles of the Kenai wilderness that begin, quite literally, just over the ridge from the race. And there is a detail that gives this theory a terrible plausibility. Michael suffered from glaucoma, which had narrowed his field of vision. In good conditions, that might mean little. In dense fog, on unfamiliar ground, with your sight already reduced to a tunnel, it could be exactly the thing that lets you walk straight past the point where you were meant to turn around and start for home. The third theory is a bear, and it is worth addressing because it comes up often and because, in Alaska, it is never an unreasonable thing to raise. But this is the theory that most people who know the mountain doubt the hardest. Military helicopters equipped to read heat were flying that terrain within hours, and some have pointed out that a bear on an open mountainside would very likely have shown up on those scans, and that a bear attack tends to leave signs, scattered evidence, that searchers would have found. None of that was there. The mountain gave up no bear and no trace of one. And that leads to the strangest wrinkle of all, the one that has kept this case alive in people's minds for over a decade. Those same heat-reading helicopters were overhead within hours of Michael going missing. Some who have looked closely at the case have argued that even a man who had collapsed and died on that mountain should have left a heat signature warm enough to catch on infrared in those first hours, and that the absence of any such signature is part of what makes the disappearance feel almost impossible. We want to be careful here, because that is an argument, not a proven fact, and cold rain and terrain and the limits of the equipment could all cut against it. But it is part of why the case unsettles people. A man went up into the fog, and the most sophisticated searching technology available found nothing at all, as though he had never been there. So which is it? Have you ever wondered how it feels to have so many explanations and not one answer among them? The honest response is the one we keep returning to on a night like this. We do not know. The likelier story, when you weigh it all, is also the least dramatic. A first-time runner, half blind in the fog, missed the turnaround, kept climbing past it, and walked over the back of the mountain into a wilderness that opens out just beyond the race and does not end for a very long way. And somewhere out there he came to rest, off the searched course, in country too vast to comb. No vortex, no doorway, just fog and a narrow field of vision and a mountain that connects, at its summit, to the whole enormous emptiness of the Kenai. Later that same year, Peggy had to walk through a process that no wedding vow prepares anyone for. Because there was no body, she went through what is called a presumptive death hearing, a court proceeding designed for exactly these situations, for the families of people lost to plane crashes and fishing accidents and mountains where remains will not be recovered and the law must nonetheless let the living move forward. Michael was declared legally dead, and even that, Peggy has said, did not feel like an answer, because a piece of paper is not a person, and being told that the law now considers your husband dead is not the same as knowing what happened to him on that mountain. Then the story took a turn that added insult to an already unbearable injury. In the aftermath, Peggy sued the Seward Chamber of Commerce, which organizes the race, alleging that the race had been run unsafely, that a man could vanish on that course because there was no adequate system to account for the runners strung out across the mountain. The case was eventually settled for a sum far smaller than the millions she had originally sought, a settlement in the low tens of thousands of dollars. But in the course of that litigation, the organizers' side did something that reveals how strange and cruel these situations can become. In an effort to defend themselves, they reached for the possibility that Michael had not died at all, that he had faked his own disappearance and walked away from his life. They obtained access to the family's financial records, searching for any sign that Michael was alive somewhere, spending money, existing quietly under the radar. We want to be careful and fair here because that accusation was a legal argument made in a lawsuit, not a finding of fact, and it deserves to be named as exactly that. They looked, and they found nothing. There was no evidence, none at all, that Michael LeMaitre was alive. No spending, no sightings, no trace of a man who by every account loved his wife and children and his generous, busy life and had no reason on earth to abandon it. Peggy has heard, over the years, the far-fetched rumors that drift around any high-profile disappearance, including the claim that her husband fled the country. Not one of them has ever produced a shred of evidence, which is to say, the accusation that he vanished on purpose is, in the end, just one more thing this family was forced to endure on top of the loss itself. The mountain did, at least, change because of him in ways that may have quietly protected others. In the years since Michael disappeared, the race added new safeguards. Runners must now attest publicly in a room full of other racers that they have actually completed training runs on the course, so that no first-timer can go up cold the way Michael did. A time limit was set for reaching the summit, and crucially, sweepers now follow behind the last runners, so that no one can simply be left up on the mountain, unaccounted for, as the volunteers come down. It is a bitter kind of legacy, safety rules written in the space a person left behind, but it is real, and it is his. There was one more moment when it seemed the mountain might give him back. In 2014, a partial human jawbone was found a few rugged miles away, near a place called Tonsina Point. For a while, there was speculation that it might be Michael, that the search was finally over. But DNA testing showed that the bone belonged to someone else entirely, a man in his late 30s, whose last known address had been far away in Arkansas, and whose own remains had first begun turning up in that area years earlier. So even the mountain's one apparent offering turned out to belong to another lost story, another person swallowed by the same terrain. It was not Michael. Michael was still up there, or wherever the fog had taken him. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to have no place to go and grieve, no grave, no marker, nothing but a mountain you can see from town on a clear day, standing exactly where it always stood, keeping its secret in plain sight? That is what Peggy LeMaitre has lived with. 14 years on, the state still lists Michael as missing, because to close a missing persons case, as one trooper explained, the law needs to place eyes on the person alive or to find remains, and neither has ever happened. Being declared legally dead did not remove him from the list of the missing. He is both at once, dead in the eyes of the court and missing in the eyes of the troopers, a contradiction that is really just the truth, which is that no one knows. Peggy has said that there will never be any closure until they find something. You always keep your hope up, she said, and you never forget. Every summer, Tens of thousands of people still pour into Seward on the 4th of July to watch runners climb that mountain and fall back down it, and somewhere on its slopes, or in a crevice, or under the shifting scree, a generous man who spent his life making things work out for other people has been waiting to be found for 14 years. A relative once said it as plainly as it can be said. The mountain swallowed this man. 3 days after Michael LeMaitre started up Mount Marathon, in that same brief window of that same Alaskan summer, another person walked into the wilderness of the same range and did not come back. Her name was Valerie, and her story pulls at a different set of threads. Let's talk about her. Valerie Jeanette Sifsoff was born in Anchorage in the autumn of 1968, and she belonged to that country in a way that most of the people in tonight's stories did not. She was Yupik and Inupiaq, Alaska native. Her family's roots sunk deep into the land long before there was an Anchorage or a Seward highway or a campground at milepost 64. She grew up between Anchorage and the community of Anderson, one of a large family of siblings, and she often traveled out to Dillingham to help with the family business. This was not a tourist in Alaska, not a young adventurer come north to test himself against the wild. This was a woman of the place who knew it, whose people had known it for generations. And that makes what happened to her land differently and heavier. By every account, Valerie was warm and full of life. The words her family and friends used were loving, compassionate, vivacious. She had lived for a time down in Seattle and then come home to Alaska, settling back in Anchorage, where she had a long-term boyfriend. A few years before the summer we are going to talk about, she had lost her mother to cancer, the kind of wound that reshapes a family. And in the summer of 2012, she was, among other things, in the middle of a happy piece of ordinary life. She was planning a baby shower for her younger sister. She was excited about it. It was exactly the kind of thing, her family said, that she would never have simply walked away from. A small, joyful obligation of love, the surest sign in the world that a person means to come back. There is one more detail worth knowing, because it speaks to how a family can be at once completely ordinary and quietly remarkable. Valerie was the aunt of an Olympic snowboarder, a young woman who would carry the family name onto the world stage. The Sifsoffs were a family with roots and reach both, tied to the villages and the water and also to the wider world. And in the summer of 2012, that whole web of people was about to be pulled tight around a single question that has never been answered. On the weekend of the 7th of July, Valerie went camping with her boyfriend at the Granite Creek campground. It sits at milepost 64 on the Seward Highway in the mountains south of Anchorage, just outside the resort community of Girdwood, in the same rugged Kenai and Chugach country, where only 3 days earlier, Michael LeMaitre had climbed into the fog above Seward and out of the world. It is beautiful there. The creek runs cold and fast off the mountains, and behind the campground the water gathers into 6 Mile Creek, a name that is going to matter before this story is over. Around midnight on the 7th, something happened between Valerie and her boyfriend, an argument, the kind of ordinary friction that flares up between two people and usually burns itself out by morning. And Valerie, upset, walked away from the campsite on foot into the dark. She did not take her things. She left her cell phone behind, and her identification, and her keys. Everything a person needs to function in the world everything you would grab on your way to somewhere. She left sitting at the campsite, which tells us she was not leaving. She was walking off to cool down the way people do, meaning to circle back. You're at that campground at midnight in early July in southern Alaska, and the first thing to understand is that it is not fully dark. At that latitude in high summer, the night is a long blue dusk, the sky never quite letting go of the light, the mountains standing black against a sky that glows faintly grey-blue at its edges. It is cold. The creek is loud, a constant rushing that fills the air and swallows smaller sounds, the sound of footsteps, the sound of a voice. The road is close, a 2-lane highway threading the valley, but the moment you step off the gravel of the campground and into the brush along the water, the trees close in and the creek roars and the campsite lights fall away behind you. A person upset, walking fast, not paying attention to the ground, following the water in the half-light, could get turned around very quickly. And the water is right there, cold and fast and higher than it looks. Her boyfriend looked for her. He could not find her. And here, the timeline develops a gap that has haunted this case, because he searched, and then he left the campground around noon the following day, and Valerie was not reported missing until the 11th of July, 4 days after she walked away from the fire. We are going to be very careful here, because Valerie's boyfriend has never been charged with anything, and it is not for us to accuse a man the authorities did not accuse. The family themselves have said it was not unusual for the couple to separate for a time after an argument, which may explain some of the delay, the assumption that she had simply gone off on her own and would resurface. But the fact remains, plainly, that 4 days passed between the night Valerie vanished into the blue dark by the creek and the day anyone official began to look for her. In this country, 4 days is a very long time. In this country, 4 days is the difference between a search and a recovery. When the report finally came in, the Alaska State Troopers searched the area around Granite Creek and they found no trace of her. They looked for about 10 days, and then, with no clues and no sign, they scaled the official search back, the same grim arithmetic that ends so many of these efforts. But Valerie's family did not stop, and at the center of that family was her father, Victor Sivsov, a fisherman, a man who knew the water of Alaska the way some men know a language. Victor was out on the bay fishing when the call came. His wife told him he had to come home right now, and he did not ask questions. He flew down immediately, and from that moment he threw everything he had into finding his daughter. The family searched in every way they could think of, with a helicopter, with dogs, with lines of people walking a few feet apart, combing the woods and the roads. Victor and his sons walked every square mile of that country around the campground. Every clue that surfaced, they chased. They looked for any place she might have fallen and been hurt, any sign at all. For a long time, Victor believed, or made himself believe, that she might have been taken, abducted, that if she were free to make a choice, she would absolutely have called home. And so the silence meant someone was keeping her from calling. And then the creek began to answer in the cruelest possible language. In August, about a month after Valerie vanished, a kayaker moving down 6 Mile Creek, the water that runs behind the campground, found her green tank top in the current, and her family, continuing their own search, found her black hoodie caught in a log jam in that same creek, about half a mile downstream from where she had walked away. 2 pieces of the clothing she had been wearing that night, pulled from the water below the campsite. For most people, clothing in a creek is a clue to puzzle over. For Viktor Sivtsov, a fisherman, it was something worse, because he understood immediately what it likely meant. He knew from a lifetime on the water that a current will pull the clothing from a body after a person drowns, that a river works a body loose from its clothes as it carries it. He said later that when the clothing turned up, it was like a stab to the heart. Sit with what that knowledge cost him. A father who had spent his life on the water, who had prayed his daughter was taken because taken meant alive, looking at her tank top pulled from a creek and understanding, in his bones, in his fisherman's knowledge, what the water had almost certainly done. In the years since, Viktor has come to accept that his daughter is probably dead. I feel more likely she fell into the water, he has said. The creek was right there. It was cold and fast and higher than it looked, and it runs into deeper water beyond, toward country where a body might travel a long way and never be found. That is the likeliest answer, and we will not pretend otherwise. In all probability, Valery Sivtsov, upset and walking in the blue midnight dark, stepped wrong near a fast, cold creek she could hear but perhaps could not clearly see, and the water took her. It is the explanation her own father, who knows that water, has come to hold. But we have to be honest that likeliest is not the same as certain. Her body has never been found. Only 2 pieces of clothing were ever recovered, and while they point toward the water, they do not close the door on every other possibility. In 2016, Valerie was legally declared dead, and yet, to this day, her case remains officially open and unsolved with the Alaska State Troopers, which is its own quiet admission that no one truly knows what happened by that creek at midnight. And here we have to talk about something larger than Valerie alone, because her story does not sit in isolation. Valery Sivtsov was an Alaska Native woman, and across Alaska and the wider North, Indigenous women go missing and are murdered at rates far, far higher than any other group, so much higher that there is now a name for the crisis, a movement of families demanding that these women not be forgotten. For generations, the disappearances of Native women were under-investigated, under-reported, treated as less urgent, allowed to go cold. When you set Valerie's 4-day gap before anyone searched against that history, it is impossible not to feel the weight of it. This is not to say her case was neglected for that reason, and it is not to accuse any one trooper or investigator of anything. It is only to say that Valerie belonged to a group of women whom this country has, for a very long time, been too slow to look for, and that her family had to do so much of the searching themselves is part of a pattern that stretches across the whole of the North. Have you ever wondered how differently these searches unfold depending on who is lost? We heard it earlier, in the bitter words of Thomas Newsy's friend, the sense that a certain kind of missing person gets all the resources and another kind gets a shrug. We hear it again here, in a father who had to walk every square mile himself. Valerie was warm and loved and rooted in that land, and planning a baby shower she was thrilled about. She was not a woman on her way out of her own life. She was a woman who left her phone and her keys at a campsite because she was coming right back. She simply never did. Her family believes she is gone, and they have said so. But believing is not finding, and hoping is not knowing, and so they keep her name alive, and they keep somewhere beneath the acceptance the smallest hope for the answer that the creek has never fully given. To be fair to that creek and to that country, it did more than most of these places ever do. It gave back a tank top and a hoodie. It gave Victor Sifsov enough to understand, and nothing at all to bury. In the ledger of Alaskan disappearances, that counts, somehow, as almost merciful. 2 people, then, lost from the same range of mountains, in the same handful of July days, in the same summer. A man who climbed into fog above a town of thousands, and a woman who walked into blue dark beside a loud creek. Michael and Valerie never met. They had almost nothing in common, a retired businessman from New York and a Yupik and Inupiaq woman from Anchorage. But the same country holds them both now, somewhere, and neither has ever been brought home. And when you realize that these 2 vanished within 72 hours of one another, in the same mountains, and that this was in no way considered strange, that the wilderness simply does this, quietly and often, you begin to understand why people invented a triangle to explain it. The truth needed no triangle. The truth only needed Alaska. And here is the thing that should trouble anyone tempted to blame the 2 July disappearances on carelessness. That same year, in that same state, the wilderness took a man who was the opposite of careless, a man who may have understood how to live in that country better than almost anyone else who has ever gone missing in it. His name was Thomas Seibold. And if Michael Lemaitre shows you that the land takes the novice, Thomas Seibold shows you that it takes the master just the same. Thomas Marco Seibold was 31 years old, a German by birth who had built a life in the North Woods of Wisconsin. He was not a tourist, and he was not a thrill seeker. He was, by every account of the people who knew him, an extraordinarily capable outdoorsman, quiet and kind and cheerful, a gentle soul with a deep, guiding drive to live the way he believed a person was meant to live. He had spent 6 years at a school called the Teaching Drum Outdoor School, first as a student and then as an instructor, learning and then teaching the old skills, living off the land in the manner of the indigenous peoples of North America before European contact. He made his own clothing and his own gear from the animals he had eaten. He had spent entire months alone in the wild. He had guided in the dead of winter and hunted reindeer in the interior of Norway. The founder of his school described him simply as a very experienced outdoorsman and a wandering spirit. If you were going to design a person to survive the Alaskan bush, you would design something very close to Thomas Seibold. In the summer of 2012, he took a leave of absence and set out on what his own father-in-law would later call a pilgrimage, a long journey into the wildest country left in America, living off the land the whole way. He began in the southeastern part of the state at an Alaska native fish camp, and he traveled north along the Tanana River near Fairbanks, moving through the country on its own terms. By September, he had reached the tiny village of Ambler in the northwest, and from there he went further still, some 30 to 40 miles up the Ambler River, deep into the Brooks Range, to an old homestead cabin just south of the gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve. That park is 8.5 million acres with no roads and no trails, reachable only by air and water, one of the emptiest places on the entire continent. Thomas meant to go into it. The last people known to have seen him were the owner of that cabin, a woman, and her young son, who left the area at the end of September. Thomas stayed on, using the cabin as a base, and then he prepared to go further. We know this because when the search finally came, troopers flew to the cabin and found his diary, a running letter he had been writing to his wife, Maggie. The last entry was dated the 7th of October. In it, he wrote that he was preparing to leave on a several-day exploration, most likely up toward the highlands at the head of the Ambler, before making a final trek of 25 or 30 miles overland to the village of Kobuk, where he had a flight booked to carry him home to Wisconsin in the middle of November. He had a plan, and it was a sound one, and he was, by any measure, the right man to carry it out. You're in that cabin, reading the last thing Thomas Seibold ever wrote. It is a letter to the woman he loved, full of the ordinary forward motion of a person who fully intends to come home, the logistics of a route, the timing of a flight. There is nothing final in it. There is no fear in it. It is a man thinking clearly and calmly about the days ahead, and it simply stops on the 7th of October, and everything after that is silence and snow. He walked out of that cabin into the Brooks Range to explore for a few days, the way he had done 100 times before in his life, and the country closed over him, expert and all. Here is where the tragedy compounds, and where you see, again, the cruel arithmetic of these searches, because Thomas was so experienced and because his flight was not until the middle of November. No one worried when the weeks passed. Why would they? He was living exactly the life he had trained for. It was only when he failed to board his flight home on the 11th of November that the alarm was finally raised, and by then more than a month had passed since that last diary entry. The search that began was, at first, cursory, and it faced an impossible situation. By the time it seriously geared up, the temperatures in the Brooks Range were pushing 35 degrees below zero, and the days had shrunk to a few hours of grey light. Troopers made several flights over close to 2 weeks, and then suspended the search in late November because there was nothing to find, and every hour in the air was a risk to the searchers themselves. His family and his community at the school refused to stop. They had read about people surviving in Arctic conditions for weeks without food or shelter, and they knew Thomas had skills that those survivors had lacked. And so they held onto hope longer than most. They raised money. They hired the same bush pilots the troopers had used, and they kept flying that country, searching from the air, planning to search on snowmobiles once there was enough snow to track. His father-in-law, a minister, spoke about it with a heartbreaking mixture of realism and faith, saying that if Thomas was not hurt, he believed he would survive, and that if he was hurt, then either the injury or the elements had finally caught up with him. And even the Park Service, even the troopers, told the family the same quiet, devastating thing that echoes through so many of these cases. They said that if it were their own loved one out there, they would keep searching too. But hope in that country runs out against the same wall as everything else. To be fair to every theory, one real possibility is that Thomas went through the ice of a river and was carried away, which happens, and which can erase a person as completely as anything. But rivers in Alaska are the highways of the wilderness, the places people travel and where bodies, in time, tend to surface. Years went by, and along the Ambler and the Shungnak, no remains were ever found, which quietly undermines even that explanation. That autumn had been a snow-short one, and a long-time observer of that country noted something that stays with you, that grassy slopes which are easy to cross under 2 feet of snow can turn lethally slick under 2 inches of it. A single slip on a slope like that, in country like that, with no one within 50 miles. That is all it would take, even for a master. Thomas Seibold was never found. Not a boot, not a pack, not a bone. One of the most capable wilderness travelers ever to go missing in Alaska walked out of a cabin to explore for a few days and became, in the words of a writer who covered the case, one more name in the land of disappearance. And that is the detail that should finally put the legend of the triangle to rest, because if the wilderness were only taking the unprepared, the careless, the first-timers like Michael LeMaitre, you could tell yourself a comforting story about caution and preparation, keeping you safe. Thomas Seibold took away that comfort. He did everything right. He knew that country as well as a person can know it. And it kept him anyway, in the same year, in the same state, as a novice on a mountain and a woman by a creek. The land does not grade on skill. Have you ever wondered whether there is any version of yourself careful enough, prepared enough, experienced enough to be safe out there? Thomas Seibold is the answer, and the answer is no. Let's talk finally about what all of these people have in common and what the land actually keeps. Here is the first thing they have in common, and it is the hardest one to sit with. Almost none of them were found. 1 plane and 44 people, gone. Another plane and 4 more, gone. A hunter given back only as a skull, decades later, and only because a stranger happened to walk the right stretch of riverbank. A nurse, gone. A runner, gone. A woman, given back only as 2 pieces of clothing in a creek. Out of everyone we have spoken about tonight, only Gary Sotherden was ever identified, and even he was never truly recovered, just a single piece of him. And even that took 46 years, and a technology no one in 1976 could have imagined. Everyone else is still out there. That is not a coincidence, and it is not the work of a vortex. It is the plain, physical reality of searching for a person in Alaska, and it is worth understanding, because once you understand it, the whole legend of the triangle quietly dissolves into something far more honest and far sadder. Think about what a search actually is. When a person goes missing in most of the country, searchers have roads, trails, houses, cell towers, ordinary human infrastructure to work with. The missing person is somewhere within a web of civilization, and the search is a matter of narrowing down where. In the Alaskan interior and the high country, there is no web. There is a single point where the person was last seen, and around it, in every direction, an ocean of wilderness that a human being on foot can barely enter, let alone comb. Searchers come in on helicopters because there is often no other way in. They fly grids over terrain where a body in dark clothing against dark rock is nearly invisible from the air. They put dogs on the ground, but dogs need scent, and cold, wet, running water destroys scent, and rain washes it away, and time scatters it. They send trained volunteers up cliffs and across scree fields that are themselves lethal, that have killed searchers and racers alike, and all of it costs money, and daylight, and the willingness of people to risk their own lives, and every one of those runs out. You're a searcher on one of these operations. You have a last known point, a spot on a mountainside or a bend in a river. You have a radius that grows by the hour because a person can walk a long way in the wrong direction, especially a person whose compass is being pulled 30 degrees off true by the iron in the ground, especially a person in fog who has lost all sense of up and down and home. Every hour that passes, the circle you have to search widens and the odds of the person surviving inside it shrink, and the two curves cross somewhere, and after that, you are no longer searching for a person. You are searching for remains in a space too large to search, in weather that is trying to kill you too. This is why the searches end, not because anyone stops caring, because the mathematics of that country are merciless and everyone involved knows it, and eventually the families are asked to agree to the thing no family should ever have to agree to, which is to stop. And here is the second thing they have in common, and it is quieter and stranger than the first. In almost every one of these cases, the person did not need to travel very far to become unreachable forever. We imagine that vanishing requires a grand journey deep into the interior, days of walking into some unmapped heart of the wild. It does not. It requires a few 100 feet in the wrong direction. Michael LeMaitre was 200 feet from the turnaround. Valerie Sivtsov was 100 yards from a fire. And to understand how that is possible, you have to understand what actually happens to a human being when they become lost, because it is not what most of us picture. The first thing that fails is your ability to walk in a straight line. It has been studied, and it turns out that without a landmark to steer by, without a sun or a distant peak or a road, people do not walk straight at all. They veer gently and consistently, and given enough distance, they walk in great looping circles, convinced the whole time that they are heading somewhere new. Now take away the landmarks entirely. Drop a wall of fog over a mountainside, the way it came down on Michael, and suddenly the summit and the sea and the town are all gone at once, and there is nothing to steer by but your own certainty, and your own certainty is lying to you. Add the magnetic pull of that country, the declination that can swing a compass 30 degrees, so that even a person doing everything right, trusting their instrument, is being walked quietly toward the wrong horizon. A confident person can march the wrong way for hours, sure they are almost home, getting further from it with every step. Then there is the water, and this is the detail that ties so many of these losses together. When a lost person is disoriented, they tend, without deciding to move downhill, because downhill is easier, because tired legs choose the path of least resistance. And downhill, in that country, means the drainages, the gullies and creek beds that funnel everything toward moving water, so the lost are drawn gently and fatally toward exactly the thing most likely to kill them, the cold, fast rivers and creeks that can take the strength from a body in minutes and carry it somewhere it will never be found. You can hear how directly that maps onto Valerie Sivtsov, upset and walking in the blue midnight dark, following the ground down toward the sound of 6 Mile Creek. You can hear it in Thomas Seibold and the river ice that may have taken him. The land does not just wait for the lost, it slopes them quietly toward the water. You're that lost person now, for just a moment, so you can feel how fast the margin disappears. It is not that you decide to be in danger, it is that the reference points fall away one by one. The fog closes. The trail you are sure of turns out to be a game path, or nothing at all. You climb a rise to get your bearings, and there is only more country in every direction, identical and enormous. The light, which felt endless an hour ago, is going flat and grey. Your legs are tired, so you go down, toward the easier ground, toward the sound of water, and the cold, which was a discomfort, becomes a clock. To be fair to every single person in these stories, not one of them was a fool. They were experienced and inexperienced, native and visiting, careful and careless, And it did not matter because getting lost is not a failure of character. It is a failure of reference points. And in that country, the reference points can vanish in the space of a single breath of fog. Now, let's talk honestly about those enormous numbers, the 16,000, the 20,000, because if we are going to be careful people, we owe you the truth about them too. Those figures get repeated everywhere, and they sound like proof of something supernatural. Thousands upon thousands of souls swallowed by a cursed triangle. But the honest reading is more complicated. Many of those thousands were found, alive or dead, and simply passed through the missing person system on their way to being located. People go missing and are recovered all the time, and the raw count of reports is not a count of the permanently vanished. What is genuinely, verifiably true, and what does not need any exaggeration, is that Alaska's rate of people going missing runs at roughly twice the national average, and that the rate at which the missing are never found runs higher still. That is the real, sober fact, and it is disturbing enough on its own. You do not need to inflate it into a supernatural body count. The truth is simply that this is a place where more than almost anywhere else, a person who disappears may never be recovered. The land keeps a higher share of what falls into it. That is all. That is enough. And here is the part that the triangle framing gets exactly backwards. The legend treats the disappearances as the mystery, as if the central question is why so many people vanish in this region. But there is no real mystery about why. We have spent the whole night answering it. People vanish there because it is the largest, emptiest, coldest, most vertical, most water-riddled, most bear-populated wilderness in the country, with the fewest roads and the fewest people and the worst weather, and because the only way across much of it is in small plains that ice up and go down. The mystery was never why. The mystery in each individual case is only ever where. And where is a question the land refuses to answer. Have you ever wondered how a family lives inside that unanswered where for years, for decades? Because that is the other thing all of these people have in common, and it may be the most important thing of all. Behind every one of these vanishings is a family left holding a question with no bottom. The Boggs and Begich families, waiting through the largest search in the nation's history, and then through 50 years of silence and rumor. The Sotherdens carving the word lost into a headstone and living beside it for 45 years. Peggy LeMaitre, standing at the base of a mountain she can still see from town, yelling a name into fog that never answered, and still, 14 years on, keeping her hope up and never forgetting. Victor Sivsov, a fisherman who knew too well what a creek does to the clothing of the drowned, walking every square mile himself. Thomas Newsy's nephew calling every number in a dead man's phone, and his friend, who only ever wanted someone to care enough to look. A disappearance without a body is a particular kind of wound, and it does not close, because closing requires an ending. And these stories have no endings. There is no grave to visit. There is no day the searching is truly, finally, allowed to stop inside a parent's heart, whatever the troopers decide. There is only the mountain, or the river, or the fog, sitting exactly where it always sat, beautiful on a clear day, keeping its secret in plain sight. The families do not get to grieve a death. They have to grieve a question, and the country that took their people offers nothing back but its own vast, indifferent silence. And for every name we have spoken tonight, there are so many we have not and never will. That is the quiet, uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Hale Boggs became the seed of a legend because he was a congressman, because his disappearance was national news, because a man of that stature does not simply evaporate without the whole country noticing. But the land does not care who you are. It took a congressman and a nurse with no fixed address on exactly the same terms. It took a retired man with a doctorate and a young hunter working the pipeline with the same complete indifference. For every Lemaitre whose face made the papers, there are dozens of Alaskans whose disappearances earned a paragraph in a local report and then nothing. People whose families searched alone and grieved alone and were never given the courtesy of the state's full attention. Thomas Newsy's friend understood this. A young woman goes missing and the public goes all out, he said, and a middle-aged man gets a shrug. Multiply that shrug across decades, across every kind of person a certain system decides is not worth the helicopter fuel, and you begin to sense the true scale of the North's quiet accounting. Look at the span of the people we have talked about. A military plane lost in 1950, a congressman's flight in 1972, a hunter in 1976, a nurse in 2001, a runner and a woman by a creek in 2012. That is more than 60 years, and it stretches from the era of paper maps and no radios to the era of satellites and cell phones that ping a tower every few minutes. And it did not matter. The technology of finding people got better and better across those decades, and the land stayed exactly as large and as cold and as hungry as it always was. And it kept taking people at the same rate and keeping them at the same rate, straight through every advance we made. You would think that in an age when a phone in your pocket can pinpoint you on a map of the entire planet, a person could not simply cease to exist over American ground. Valerie Sivsov left that very phone at a campsite in 2012, and it did not save her because she was not carrying it, and because the creek does not read maps. You're a person, any person, standing at the edge of that country. You could be any of them. You could be experienced or a novice, native to the land or a visitor, young or old, careful or reckless, and it would change your odds only at the margins because the fundamental fact would be the same for all of you. Take a few wrong steps into that wilderness, in the wrong weather, at the wrong moment, and you can be gone, completely and permanently gone, while other human beings go about their day less than a mile away. That is not a curse. It is a kind of terrible democracy. The land treats every person who wanders too far into it precisely alike, and what it does to them, it does quietly, and it keeps the rest to itself. We started tonight with the legend, the triangle, the vortexes and the shapeshifters and the lost pyramid under the ice, and I told you we would not spend our time there, and we have not. But I want to be fair to why those stories exist one last time, because it matters. People reach for the supernatural not because they are foolish, but because the real explanation is almost impossible to hold. It is easier to believe in a doorway to another dimension than to believe that Michael LeMaire, a good and generous man, took a few wrong turns in fog 200 feet from the top and was erased close enough to touch. It is easier to believe in an ancient, waiting thing in the woods than to believe that a creek pulled the clothing from Valerie Sivsov in the dark while her family slept 100 yards away. The supernatural, strange as it sounds, is the comforting version because it makes these losses mean something, makes them chosen, makes them part of a design. The truth is that they mean nothing. They are accidents of geography and weather and bad luck in a place large enough to make an accident final. And that meaninglessness is so much heavier than any dark legend that people would rather have the legend. We are not going to give them the legend. We are going to give them the truth, and the truth is simply this. Alaska is the largest, wildest, emptiest place in the country, and sometimes it keeps the people who go into it, and it does not tell anyone where. There is no mystery in the why. There is only grief in the where. And there are the people themselves, who are never mysteries at all, only human beings, each one the center of a whole world, each one owed the dignity of being remembered as a person and not as a statistic in someone's triangle. So before we let them go for the night, let's do the one thing the land refused to do. Let's account for them. Let's say their names. But before the names, one more thought, because there is a kind of quiet heroism running underneath all of this that deserves to be spoken aloud. For every person the land took, there were others who went in after them. Volunteers from mountain rescue groups who climbed the same cliffs that had already killed people that day, searching for a runner they had never met. Guardsmen flying helicopters through fog to grid a mountainside. Neighbors in a town of 3,000 who gave up their 4th of July and their days after it to walk a mountain calling a stranger's name. A fisherman and his sons walking every square mile of a valley for a daughter and a sister. A nephew calling every number in a dead man's phone because no one else would. The wilderness is indifferent, but the people are not. In the face of a country that gives nothing back, human beings keep going into it anyway, keep searching long past the point of reason, because someone is missing, and that is simply what you do. If these stories are, in part, about how little the land cares, they are also about how much we do, and both of those things are true at once, and the second one is the one worth carrying home. And there is something these stories quietly ask of you, sitting wherever you are, listening in the dark, not fear. Fear is the cheap response, and it is not the point. What they ask is attention. They ask you to notice the people at the edges, the ones who travel alone, the ones with no fixed address, the ones whose absence would ring no bell for days. Thomas Newsy vanished, and almost no one was positioned to notice because he had built a life with very few bells in it. And there are people like that in every town, quietly orbiting the rest of us. These stories ask you to be a bell, to be the person who notices when someone does not show up, who asks the question a day sooner rather than 4 days later, who keeps a friend's itinerary, who calls to check. Most of us will never stand at the base of an Alaskan mountain yelling into fog, but all of us know someone who could slip out of the world a little too quietly, and all of us can pay a little more attention than we do. Have you ever wondered what you would want if it were you out there, if you were the one the fog took? Almost certainly it would be this: to be looked for and to be remembered, to not become, in the end, just a number in a legend, a statistic swallowed by a triangle that was never real, to have someone, somewhere, still say your name and mean it, still want the answer, still refuse to let you become only a mystery. That is the least we can offer the people we have spent this night with, and it costs us nothing, and it is the one thing the land can never take, so let's give it to them. Let's remember who they were, and not only how they were lost. Remember the 44 aboard the Skymaster in the winter of 1950. We do not have all of their names in front of us tonight, and that itself is part of their story. Service members and crew and a handful of civilians who made an ordinary winter crossing and were gone before the radio finished its last calm sentence. 44 whole lives, 44 sets of people waiting at the other end, 44 absences that opened in a single afternoon and never closed. They were the first great swallowing, the one that came long before anyone thought to draw a triangle, and they deserve to be remembered not as the opening statistic of a legend, but as 44 human beings who boarded a plane expecting to land. Remember Hale Boggs, who spent 30 years in service to his country and carried private doubts he never got to fully voice, and who was, beneath the title and the power, a husband and a father, whose family would spend 50 years living in the shadow of a question. Remember Nick Begich, the school teacher turned congressman, a father of 6 who was simply trying to hold on to a hard seat, whose young son grew up to carry his name back into the Senate. Remember Russell Brown, the aide, the young man whose name comes last in every telling and who was there, faithfully doing his job with a family of his own who mourned him no less than anyone mourned the famous men beside him. And remember Don Yons, the pilot, who knew that dangerous sky as well as any man alive, who had written about its dangers, and who flew into it that grey morning, trusting his skill against a country that does not care how skilled you are. 4 men in a small plane, still out there, somewhere along 500 miles of the most rugged coast on the continent, more than 50 years gone. Remember Gary Frank Sotherden, the free spirit from Clay, New York, who could not settle for the ordinary and went looking for the edge of the map and found it. Remember that he was somebody's son and somebody's brother, that his parents loved him enough to send a guide up the Porcupine by canoe, enough to carve the honest word lost into his headstone, rather than pretend to a certainty they did not have. Remember that he got, in the end, the rarest gift in all these stories, a name given back to him after 46 years, so that a stone that said only lost in Alaska could finally say something more. He went into that country chasing freedom, and the country kept nearly all of him, but not the memory, not anymore. Remember Thomas Anthony Nuzzi, the nurse who spent his life keeping other people's schedules and medication straight, who cared for strangers in a hard country and asked for very little in return, who built a life so quiet and so portable that his absence rang almost no bell at all. Remember that he deserved more people looking for him than he had, that his friend only ever wanted someone to care, that a man who tended to so many should not have slipped away so unnoticed. Whether the wilderness took him, or someone used the wilderness to hide what they had done, we do not know, and we may never, but we know he mattered, and we can say so. Remember Michael Lemaitre, who held a doctorate and used it to help airmen find their way to new careers, who sat with the dying in hospice and with children orphaned on the worst day of their lives, who spent his whole adult life in motion, boating and skiing and climbing and fishing, always, by his family's account, able to make things work out. Remember that his last words with his wife were, "I love you and have a good race," and that Peggy stood at the bottom of that mountain yelling his name into the fog, and that 14 years later she still keeps her hope up and still refuses to forget. Remember that the safety rules on that mountain today exist because he did not come down, that even in vanishing he made the place a little safer for the runners who came after. The mountain swallowed him. It did not swallow what he was. And remember Valerie Jeanette Sivsov, warm and vivacious and rooted in that land as deeply as a person can be, Yupik and Inupiaq, home from Seattle, planning her little sister's baby shower with a joy that proves she meant to come back. Remember that she left her phone and her keys and her whole life at a campsite because she was only stepping away for a moment. Remember Victor, her father, the fisherman who prayed she had been taken because taken meant alive, and who understood, when the creek gave back her clothing, exactly what the water had likely done, and had to carry that knowing. Remember that she belonged to a long line of native women this country has been far too slow to look for, and that her family looked anyway, walked every square mile anyway, kept her name alive anyway. She was not a mystery. She was a daughter and a sister and an aunt, and she was loved, and she is still somewhere out in the country of her own people. And remember Thomas Seibold, the gentle soul from the Northwoods who wanted only to live the way he believed a person was meant to live, close to the land, taking from it just what he needed and making the rest with his own hands. Remember that he was a master of that life, not a reckless boy chasing danger, but a careful, centered man who did not take undue risks, and that the last thing he ever wrote was an ordinary, hopeful letter to his wife about coming home. Remember that his people refused to stop looking for him, that they flew that frozen country themselves long after the authorities had turned back, that they loved him enough to keep the planes in the air over 8.5 million acres of emptiness on the strength of nothing but hope. He went into the wild to meet it on its own terms, as he always had, and this time it kept him. But it did not get to say who he was. That is all of them. The 44 in the winter sky, the 4 in the small plane, the hunter, the nurse, the runner, the woman by the creek, the gentle master of the woods. Some of them we have known by rich detail, and some only by a few spare facts, but every single one of them was a whole human life, the center of a world, mourned by people who are still, in many cases, waiting. We have said their names because the land would not, because a triangle drawn on a map turns people into a number, and they were never numbers. They were persons, each one, right up until the moment the country closed over them, and long after. We began this night with a legend, and we are ending it with the truth, and the truth is quieter and kinder to the dead than any legend could be. There is no curse over that country. There is no doorway in the ice, no ancient thing in the trees choosing its victims. There is only Alaska, the largest and wildest and emptiest place left in America, doing what such a place has always done, which is occasionally, and without any cruelty and without any design, keeping the people who walk too far into it. The mystery was never why. We know why. The mystery, in every single case, is only ever where. And where is the one thing that vast country refuses again and again to give back. So tonight, as you think about Michael's story and Valerie's and Gary's and Thomas's and the men in the planes that never landed, maybe hold on to this. Do not remember them for how they were lost. The losing was the least of them, a matter of fog and cold and bad luck and a country too big to search. Remember them for how they lived, a father who sat with the dying and the orphaned, a woman planning a baby shower for a sister she adored, a free spirit chasing the edge of the map, a gentle man who made his own clothes from the animals he ate and wrote love letters home. Remember that the people who loved them are still out there too, still keeping hope up, still refusing to forget, and that the least we can do from wherever we are is refuse to forget along with them. The wilderness keeps their bodies. It does not get to keep their names. Those belong to us now, to everyone who took the time to listen carefully tonight and to say them once more into the quiet, before we go. Their stories are unfinished. The mountains and the rivers and the fog are still exactly where they have always been, beautiful in the morning light, keeping their secrets in plain sight. And somewhere out in all that vast and silent country, the people we spoke of tonight are still waiting to be found. Rest well.